There's a grain that falls from the sky every autumn. It requires no planting, no plowing, no irrigation. For 9,000 years, it fed millions of people across California with more calories per acre than wheat. Then Europeans arrived, called it famine food, and replaced entire forests with crops that needed water, labor, and luck. We didn't abandon acorns because they failed. We abandoned them because a tree that feeds you for free cannot be taxed, cannot be sold, cannot be controlled. This is the story of the bread that grew on trees, the grain that required no purchase, no debt, no dependence. The food system colonizers feared so much they cut down the forest and criminalized the knowledge. The archive opens in the coastal ranges and valleys of California, sometime around 7000 BCE. Long before wheat fields stretched across continents, before grain silos and flour mills, California had bakeries in every canyon. They were called oak groves. Every autumn, a single mature oak dropped 500 to 2,000 pounds of acorns. The Miwok, Pomo, Yurok, Ohlone, Chumash, and over 100 other tribes built entire civilizations on this harvest. They did not farm the oaks, they partnered with them. Controlled burns cleared underbrush, preventing catastrophic wildfires and encouraging new growth. Selective harvesting ensured trees stayed healthy and productive. Certain groves were considered sacred, managed by specific families who understood every tree's personality and every season's rhythm. This was not foraging. It was forestry older than the pyramids. A mature valley oak produces enough acorns to feed a family for an entire year. Black oaks give sweeter, oilier nuts, perfect for rich mush. Blue oaks fruit even in drought years when nothing else survives. Indigenous Californians knew every species, every microclimate, every grove that produced the fattest acorns. They built entire villages near oak stands the way Europeans built cities near rivers. The trees were infrastructure, living granaries that required no maintenance, no seed purchases, no machinery. Just patience and respect. By the time Spanish explorers arrived in the 1500s, California's indigenous population was estimated at over 300,000 people. Many anthropologists now believe it was closer to 1 million. Almost all of them depended primarily on acorns, not as a supplement, as their staple grain. The trees held an economy older than any empire. Acorns are 50% fat, 6% protein, 40% carbohydrates. More calorie-dense than wheat, loaded with fiber, vitamins B6 and E, potassium, magnesium, iron. 1 pound of acorn flour contains 2,100 calories, enough to sustain a person for a full day. And unlike wheat, which spikes blood sugar and crashes energy, acorn starch digests slowly. It was endurance fuel built for long hunts, long winters, long lives. But there's a problem. Raw acorns are loaded with tannins, bitter, astringent compounds that make them inedible. Eat them straight from the tree and your mouth puckers, your stomach rebels. Europeans tasted them once and called them pig food. Indigenous people developed a technique that turned bitterness into bread. The process is called leaching. Its chemistry perfected over thousands of years. First, crack the acorns and remove the shells. Grind the nuts into fine flour using stone mortars. Some of these grinding rocks, still visible in California today, have depressions worn 3 feet deep from generations of use. Then comes the alchemy. Place the flour in a woven basket lined with leaves or in a shallow sand pit near a stream. Pour cold water over it, slowly, methodically, for hours or sometimes days. The water dissolves the tannins and carries them away. You keep pouring until the water runs clear, until you taste the flour and find it sweet. Hot springs were used by some tribes. Others buried flour in riverbeds, letting running water do the work over weeks. The result? A sweet, nutty flour that could be cooked into mush, shaped into cakes, or stored for years without spoiling. Europeans saw primitiveness. They were looking at PhDs in food science. The prepared flour was mixed with water and cooked into a thick porridge, often flavored with berries, dried fish, or herbs. It could be baked on hot rocks into flatbreads. It could be dried into traveling food that lasted months. Acorn mush wasn't just sustenance, it was ceremony, family, identity. Villages held acorn festivals every autumn. Elders taught children which trees to harvest, how to grind, how to leach. Songs were sung during processing. Stories were told about the first people who learned to turn bitter into sweet. It was a food system woven into every part of life. And then the missions came. When Spanish missionaries arrived in California in 1769, they found indigenous people living in permanent villages with populations in the thousands. No farms, no livestock, just oak groves managed like orchards. The missionaries were baffled. How could people thrive without wheat fields or cattle ranches? They called eating acorns barbaric, something to be corrected through Christianization and civilization. Father Junipero Serra wrote in 1770 that the natives must be taught to eat proper food. Bread made from wheat, not mush made from tree nuts. The missions forced converts to eat wheat porridge and cornmeal. Acorns were banned as pagan food associated with old ways that needed to be erased. Within 2 generations, the knowledge began to fade, not because it failed, because it was criminalized. But there was something deeper happening, something about power. Europeans hated acorn mush. They said it was bland, gritty, too earthy, but that was not about flavor. It was about control. Wheat requires property ownership. You need cleared land, plows, seed, mills, bakeries, markets. Wheat creates dependence on systems, on infrastructure, on those who own the means of production. Acorns require none of that. They fall from communal trees prepared with river water cooked over any fire. A food system built on acorns cannot be controlled, cannot be taxed, cannot generate profit for empires. So they called it primitive. They replaced oak groves with wheat fields and vineyards. And when people resisted, they cut down the trees. By the 1850s, the gold rush brought loggers, ranchers, and settlers by the thousands. Oak forests were cleared for farmland, chopped for firewood, burned to make way for cattle. Between 1850 and 1950, California lost over 90% of its valley oaks. The trees that had fed people for 9,000 years were gone in a century. Tribes who protested were forcibly removed to reservations. Their oak groves became someone else's wheat fields. The irony is almost unbearable. Those wheat fields required irrigation from rivers that had been managed by controlled indigenous burns for millennia. Without the burns, the land dried out. Soil degraded, the crops failed. The oaks, which needed no water, no care, no inputs, could have survived it all. But they were already cut down. And the people who knew how to work with them were being systematically erased. In the 1870s, the U.S. government began forcing indigenous children into boarding schools. The motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Children were punished for speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or talking about traditional foods. Acorn knowledge became contraband. Grandmothers taught granddaughters in secret, passing down leaching techniques in whispers. Baskets were hidden. Grinding stones were buried. By the 1950s, an entire generation had grown up never tasting acorn mush. Settlers called acorns famine food, something people ate only when nothing else was available. But oral histories tell a different story. Acorn stores were insurance. When Spanish missions controlled grain supplies and starved resistant tribes, acorns kept people alive. When gold rush miners depleted game and fish populations, acorns sustained communities through brutal winters. When reservations received spoiled flour and rancid government meat, families survived on hidden acorn caches buried in the hills. It was not famine food, it was freedom food. The one thing colonizers could not ration, could not spoil, could not control. As long as the trees stood, people could survive outside the system. That's why the trees had to go. But erasure has a way of revealing itself through absence. In the 1970s, nutritionists finally got around to analyzing acorn flour. What they found shocked them. Acorn flour contains complex carbohydrates that stabilize blood sugar, healthy monounsaturated fats similar to olive oil, more fiber per serving than oatmeal, zero gluten, and is high in antioxidants. Compared to wheat flour, acorn flour had double the fat, triple the fiber, and a glycemic index low enough for people with diabetes. Another study looked at health records of indigenous Californians who maintained traditional diets into the early 1900s. Those who ate acorn-based diets had virtually no heart disease, no diabetes, and no obesity. The rates of those conditions skyrocketed after the forced adoption of wheat and sugar rations. The science proved what elders had been saying for 150 years. We were healthier before wheat. Around the same time, ecologists began studying California's fire history. They discovered that for thousands of years, indigenous people had used controlled burns to manage oak forests. Fire cleared underbrush, killed pests, returned nutrients to soil, and encouraged acorn production. Then came fire suppression policies in the early 1900s. The U.S. Forest Service banned all burning, calling it destructive and primitive. Without fire, oak forests grew dense and tangled, underbrush choked out young trees, acorn yields dropped, trees became vulnerable to disease and insects, and when wildfires finally came, they burned hotter and deadlier than anything seen in recorded history. The policy designed to protect forests destroyed the very system that had sustained them for 9 millennia. Today, after a century of catastrophic fires, California is finally allowing indigenous-led controlled burns again. The oaks are responding. They remember. Even after the logging stopped, the erasure continued through law. Reservations often lacked oak groves. Tribes were deliberately relocated to marginal lands far from their ancestral forests. Gathering acorns on public land required permits that many could not afford or did not know existed. Some counties classified acorn harvesting as poaching. Children continued to be punished in schools for bringing traditional foods. Teachers called acorn mush dirty, uncivilized. The recipes survived only underground, whispered, hidden. Contraband knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter when no one was watching. By the 1980s, it seemed like acorn culture might die completely. But something was stirring. In the 1990s, native chefs like Loretta Barrett Oden began cooking traditional acorn dishes in restaurants, bringing the food back into public view. Anthropologists raced to document leaching techniques before the last fluent practitioners passed away. In 2010, the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum at the University of California, Berkeley, held the first public acorn processing workshop in decades. Elders demonstrated grinding, leaching, and cooking techniques to an audience that included their own grandchildren, many tasting acorn mush for the first time. One elder said, "We are not teaching this because it is history. We are teaching it because it is survival." By 2020, indigenous food sovereignty movements were planting oak groves on reclaimed land. Tribal schools added acorn processing to their curricula. Children learned to crack, grind, and leach the way their ancestors had for 9,000 years. Acorn mush appeared at powwows, cultural centers, and community gatherings. This was not revival. It was reclamation. The knowledge had never died. It had been hidden, protected, kept alive in the margins until it was safe to bring it back into the light. Today, California is burning. Droughts are killing almond orchards and grapevines, crops that demand massive irrigation in a state running out of water. Farmers are abandoning fields. Wells are running dry. Meanwhile, native oaks still stand in canyons and hillsides, producing food with zero irrigation, zero fertilizer, zero pesticides. They are drought-proof, fire-adapted, perennial. One oak can produce acorns for 300 years. Wheat lasts one season. As climate change makes industrial agriculture impossible in and more places, the answer might be growing overhead, dropping 2,000 pounds of food every autumn, waiting for us to remember how to use it. Scientists are finally paying attention. Studies now show that acorn-based food systems produce more calories per acre than wheat in Mediterranean climates, with a fraction of the water and no soil degradation. Oaks build soil, wheat depletes it. Oaks survive fire, wheat burns. Oaks feed wildlife, prevent erosion, sequester carbon, and create shade that cools entire ecosystems. Wheat does none of these things. The crop we called primitive is exactly what a collapsing climate needs. We didn't lose acorns. We were told to forget them. We replaced forests with fields, leaching baskets with flour mills, 9,000 years of knowledge with 200 years of dependence. But the oaks never left. They're still standing in parks, backyards, hiking trails, producing food no one picks, feeding squirrels and jays while humans buy bread shipped from 1,000 miles away. Every autumn, millions of pounds of acorns fall to the ground and rot. Free food, free grain, the bread that grows on trees, wasted because we forgot how to see it. The fourth sister was underground. The acorn was overhead, both waiting, both ready. The question isn't whether acorns can feed us, it's whether we're ready to remember that food doesn't have to be bought. Sometimes it just falls from the sky. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe to Nature Lost Vault and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The knowledge lives in the trees, in every oak still standing, in every elder still teaching, in every child learning to crack shells and leach flour. The bread that grew on trees is still here. We just forgot to look up.